rule number one, there's this thing called cognitive dissonance. And keep in mind, I mean, when we're freestyling here, the thing I love about PowerPoint presentations is it has spell check on it. I am probably the worst speller on the face of the planet. All right, cognitive dissonance is an interesting thing. It's a psychological term that deals with the philosophies behind cognition. So if you go all the way back to Ivan Pavlov, who was a scientist studying digestion, he would implant a vial into a dog's mouth, and he would feed them, and basically he was studying how much saliva the dog would produce in the presence of a food powder. What Ivan Pavlov recognized is when the technicians came in to feed the dogs, that they began salivating at the sight of the technician, not necessarily at the sight of the food. And so what he did is he conducted an experiment in which he took a bell and he rang the bell every time the dogs were fed. Pretty soon he went and he removed the technician, he removed the food, rang the bell, and the dogs would salivate. And so classical conditioning is a concept where an action becomes associated with a reaction, or a reaction is associated to an action. As humans, as a human species, we are subject to classical conditioning. And as a human species, we are an animal species. Doesn't matter if you believe in Darwinism or God. When it comes down to it, there's some similarities between us and the rest of the animals on the planet, right? We're not going to necessarily get too much into that. We're just going to call it the human species. Classical conditioning is present to a certain extent in the human species. What helps us understand human behavior better is this term called cognitioning or cognition. So cognition is really a term that tries to describe the thought processes in the brain, but it also really tries to describe a concept of learning. So cognitive really is associated to learning. And one of the stories I like to tell in an effort to try to express or explain the concept of cognition or cognitioning, my 18-year-old son, when he was about 3 years old, in the kitchen, his mom was making pancakes. The griddle was on the counter. She was standing there, and he was, his 3-year-old self standing right next to her, reached up to try to touch the hot griddle. And so she slapped his hand away, and he did it again, and she slapped his hand away and said, no, and he did it again, and she's like, no, don't touch that, it's hot. Kind of got after him a little bit. And my son, you can see in his eyes the cogs, just like the wheels in his brain are churning, and so he literally takes his hands like this, puts them behind his back, stands up on his tippy toes, and places his top lip on the hot griddle. So, in that moment, and I have the permission of my son to share the story, in that moment, what did he learn? It's hot. Ouch, right? Pain. In that moment, he learned more from that action than anything his mother could have told him. All day long, she tried to express to him, that's hot. Don't touch it. That's hot. Don't touch it. But in an instant, it made sense. The reason why mom said not to touch it, right? This is the essence of cognition. This is the essence of cognitioning. It is literally the learning from life experience. The concept, okay? So if cognitive or cognition or cognitive is learning, dissonance would be disorder. Another way to look at it would be a violation of expectations. So if we're talking about my son, He burned his lip on the griddle. He's associated this object as being hot. What if the next time he touched it, it was actually cold? Or, prior to this, what if it was in the cupboard and he had actually spent time playing with it? And he could recognize it, he knew what it was, and it was cold, and it didn't hurt him. Where am I going with this? If my son associates a pancake griddle as being cold, and he places his lip on it, and it's suddenly hot, think about the context of what goes on inside of the brain. A violation of expectations. One of the publications that I read, it's one of the research studies that this philosophy is based off of, talks about cognitive dissonance being a violation of expectation, and it does a thought experiment. And I love Albert Einstein's concept of thought experiments. Albert Einstein used to sit, and he would imagine, and he would think, and he would work through problems. And that's actually how he came up with a lot of his solutions and a lot of his theories, is he would just sit there and kind of daydream. So this thought experiment, they say, imagine that you're outside, that it's raining, you don't have an umbrella, you're not getting wet. Rain is associated to wet. So if I'm standing outside and it's raining and the water is coming down on me and I'm not getting wet, what do you think my brain is doing? Trying to figure out what the hell's going on. This concept of cognitive dissonance, or a violation of expectations, is associated to learning based on environment. So let's talk about a really smart guy by the name of Abraham Maslow. Just for the record, I think Maslow was absolutely on the right track. He was really 1950s when he came out with his theories, his hierarchy of need. There's some people that say that he's full of crap. There's some people that have really patterned entire treatment programs off of his hierarchy of need. Ultimately, what Maslow said is that as a human species, we have to fill a need, a tertiary or a singular need, before we can go to a secondary need. And a secondary need before we can go to a tertiary need. So what he said is that, in essence, our physiological need, I can't spell tonight. Physiological needs such as air, food, water, warmth, right? These are basic needs. What he says is if these needs are not being met, we're not going to get anything else done. This is where the philosophy or the theory kind of doesn't hold water, just a little bit. And the reason why I'm bringing this forward is that his suggestion, really at the basic levels, his suggestion is if I'm standing at the edge of a swimming pool, and this is the deep end, and I jump in and I can't swim, ultimately what Maslow is saying is that I'm sinking to the bottom. I'm fine because I've got plenty of oxygen in the first couple seconds, right? But as I'm sinking to the bottom, I'm thinking, oh crap, I'm in a swimming pool, I'm sinking to the bottom, I can't swim. Sooner or later, as my body becomes starved for oxygen, and that centered feeling of I gotta breathe becomes more intense, what Maslow is saying is the only thing I'm thinking of is my survival and what I need the most, which is air. Time and time again, humans don't have their physiological needs met, but yet they do really weird, spectacular acts of service. For instance, there's a guy who was on an airplane that crashed into an icy river. Rescue helicopter comes, drops the lifesaver, he passes it to the next guy. Come back, he passes it to the next guy, passes it to the next guy, passes it to the next guy, passes it to the next guy. Plane goes under with him on it. Theoretically speaking, under Maslow, he's in an icy river. He should have taken and clung to that life preserver because that is what he physiologically needed in order to stay alive. But he systematically passed it and passed it and passed it. And there were more than 5 or 6 different people that are living today because he gave them the life preserver time and time again. So, without too much debate over this, we are going to assume that we have our physiological needs met. Because the one thing about the United States of America and in this society, we really do have our physiological needs met. In fact, even our homeless population does a pretty good job of getting a meal. Even our homeless population does better and this is kind of a broad statement, but our homeless population probably does better than some people in third world countries, honestly. So assuming that we have our physiological needs met, the next area that Maslow talked about was a concept of safety. And really what it comes down to is safety is equal to trust, which is an environmental concept. So safety in relation to trust, because Maslow talks about the next thing being relationships, and then esteem, and then crap, what comes after that? Self-actualization. That's right, that's what I thought. I was trying to remember if there was something between esteem and this concept called self-actualization. Okay? So what they're talking about is the concept of safety down here, which is associated to environment. I have to feel safe first before I can develop a relationship. And I have to develop a relationship before I can develop self-esteem. And I have to have self-esteem before I can self-actualize. And the term self-actualization in Maslow's context is really the strength to embrace that which is good about me and remove that which is bad about me. Notice now I said good, bad. In this context, we're not necessarily going to use good and bad. We're going to use terms which are called adaptive and maladaptive. Okay? Adaptive is equal to growth or human growth. And maladaptive is equal to an absence of growth. So maladaptive is not just an opposite of adaptive. Maladaptive is an absence of adaptive. One of the ways that we can describe this, light exists as particles called photons that travel in waves. True or false? I didn't hear anything. True or false? Is that a true statement or a false statement? True. Light is a thing. True or false? True. Darkness exists as an absence of light. True or false? Like cold exists as an absence of heat. True or false? Death exists as an absence of life. Right? Adaptive and maladaptive. Maladaptive exists as an absence of a thing. So if adaptive is equal to human growth, and we want to put a good, bad moniker on it. That's fine. Adaptive qualities, adaptive characteristics, adaptive really comes down to and talks about what I need in order to do this thing right here called self-actualization, which is really a concept of learning. Some people theorize that in high-risk populations, the ability to self-actualize, and remember, that's the strength to embrace adaptive qualities and get rid of maladaptive qualities. And I say strength very intently, right? The strength to embrace that which is good and get rid of that which is bad. This concept of self-actualization, there are some people who theorize that it's absent in high-risk populations. And when they say absent, some even have suggested that this person does not have the ability to actualize. But at the core, if you really understand what self-actualization is cognition. Self-actualization is learning. But self-actualization is also a strength. To take what is good and get rid of what is bad. Who can give me the scientific method really quick? Try off the top of your head. Put you college students on the spot. What is the scientific method? The scientific method.
Like the order? Or just like what it is?
What is it?
It's a way to test a hypothesis for a consistent outcome.
Test a hypothesis for a consistent outcome. Now enter that into life. Theories of cognition talks about learning from life experiences. And we can debate all day long about nature versus nurture. There is actually some good, solid, concrete evidence that shows that nurture or environment has greater strength than nature. So genetically speaking, I am born not just as a viable tissue mass, right? Because at some point, egg and sperm combine and then the egg begins to split and split and split. They call that a viable tissue mass until the embryo can exist outside of the mother's womb, is kind of the concept of where they come down to. But what we're talking about is, genetically speaking, I am born with specific traits. Blue eyes, brown hair, what have you. Temperament. Parts of our personality absolutely fall within genetic material, 100%. And you can see that traits passing from father to son, mother to right, down the line, right? But the research is talking about the concept of environment having a stronger predictive factor or stronger predictive quality on outcome than simply genetics alone. So the scientific method speaks of really not necessarily a hypothesis. I mean, part of it is, this is what I think is going to happen, then I'm going to test it, and then I'm going to compare the outcome to what I thought was going to happen. Now remember our term of cognitive dissonance, a violation of expectation. How much of this sounds like the scientific method? My suggestion to you is that humans are born with a natural tendency to learn from our environment. That the scientific method is an instinctual trait. And when I say instinctual trait, I'm talking about homing pigeons, right? Who know how to get home. An instinctual trait. There is certain learning that takes place out in the African veldt where a lion, an adult lion, teaches a young cub how to hunt, but a large part of that is instinctual, meaning they are born with these traits that allow them to feed themselves. So when Darwin talks about these traits of being the survival of the fittest, and the strongest of the species gets to procreate and pass on its traits to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation. And I'm not saying Darwin is full of crap at all, because I think there is evidence of an evolution per se that takes place from one generation to another generation. What we're talking about is the strength of environment over genetics. So let that sink in just a little bit. The strength of environment over genetics. So twin studies are an awesome, awesome thing, because you have identical twins and fraternal twins. So identical twins are one egg, one sperm, one conception. At some point, the egg splits in half and creates two genetic copies of the one, right? Not just both eggs, not both viable tissue masses being genetically similar, they are exactly the same genetic material, split in half. Both grow into babies, right? It's the reason why identical twins look alike. At the end of the day, from birth to about age 30, one identical twin lives his own life, the other identical twin lives his own life, and depending on how he goes and his environment, you're going to get differences in height, you're going to differences in weight, because they're not the same person, right? And even depending on how healthy they are, their facial features might begin to change a little bit. But for the most part, identical twins are genetically the same. In fact, if you had one twin break into a home, cut himself, leave blood behind, and you did a genetic test, the genetics would be the same between both twins. Okay? With that same genetics, what the researchers and the scientists are doing with that concept of the same genetics is they study outcomes of twins. Because theoretically speaking, because they come from the same genetics, there should be similar outcomes, right? And so this is where addiction science comes in. They start looking at identical twins, and they want to know, one twin develops an addiction, the other twin develops an addiction, right? So they look at addiction as being a genetic trait that a person is born with. And so when we're talking about a genetic trait, we're talking about something that has no choice whatsoever, right? Because at conception, the sperm and the egg combine, and then the blender of life, right, mixes up those genetic codes to the point where every single person in this room is a genetic miracle. It is statistically impossible for another person to be like you, ever, because of the way the genetics are involved in it. And when I say a genetic miracle, each and every single person sitting in this class is such a fundamental miracle of nature. There never will be another person like you, ever, past, present, or future. And depending on how you want to proceed with that, the suggestion then comes, if there's nobody who will ever be like you, then that gives a unique value to every last single human being who has ever stepped foot on this planet. And without getting too controversial, let's talk about the potential of all human beings, up to including beginning at conception, right? The point of this comes down to genetic choice. I have zero control, zero choice over who I am at the time of birth. That is left to either complete and total chance based on Darwin or divine intervention based on God, depending on which you fall through with, right? I have often said that if you want evidence of God and you wake up dead, that's probably some pretty good evidence there might be something on the other side, right? But that's one of those experiments that you have to actually physically engage yourself in And until such time, unfortunately, that discussion becomes somewhat conjecture, right? So let's get back to the concept then of genetics. I have no choice. So if addiction is a genetic trait, meaning I have blue eyes, I am 6'3", actually I'm shrinking, because as you get older, the discs in your back compress. So I was 6'3", I'm now 6'2.5" or something like that, right? I have gray hair. I started going gray when I was 14. My son, my 18-year-old son, started going gray when he was 11. My father has a full head of hair. It's pure white. His grandfather or his father had full head of hair. It's pure white, right? And so my whole entire life, I'm like, great. Grandpa and dad both have white hair. They all had their hair completely. Grandpa had a full head of hair when he died. I'm going gray, my hair's going white. That means that my hair ain't gonna fall out. But then I get my mom's genetics, which makes me start balding right here. It's whatever. I've got a misshaped head, so when I start shaving my head, when my hair falls out, it's just, I'll just walk around with this weird shaped head. It's all good. It's whatevs. Genetically speaking, right? Choice comes down to this. I didn't have choice on what kind of hair I get. So what we're talking about is a genetic trait of addiction. If it is purely genetic, if the gene is present, then the trait is present. So twin studies. If addiction is purely genetic, if one twin developed an addiction, the other twin should develop an addiction 100% of the time. Yes?
Don't you think that addiction is like a combination of several traits and not necessarily just one?
Remember, the gene science, there's been a lot of money and a lot of effort trying to identify specific genes, because if you can identify a gene, then maybe you can manipulate it to the point where you can turn it off, right? So yes, addiction is multi-complex. I mean, it's various genetic traits.
And addiction is a genetic trait. It would be like several.
Several genetic traits. Sure, absolutely. But the context of the issue comes down to, in these twin studies, when they followed them, most of the time they would follow these people for years and years and years. What they found is that one twin would develop an addiction and the other twin would not develop an addiction. So that right there, what the outcome of that scientific study concludes that addiction is not just a genetic problem. In fact, when it comes down to it, what they found was how much and how often a person consumes a drug. So how much and how often, right? If I'm drinking every weekend, and I'm drinking a lot every weekend, how much I consume and how often I consume it has more to do with developing an addiction than anything else. Hands down.
Say that again.
How much and how often I consume a drug has more to do with developing an addiction than anything else. Any genetic trait, any genetic marker, anything. And how much and how often I consume a drug has everything to do with what? Sure. What else?
Didn't you say that people do drugs as a maladaptive coping skill? So maybe
100%.
there were times in their lives and they went to drugs to cope.
100%. But what is that? Did you guys choose to come to class tonight? Did you guys choose to drink water? Did you guys choose to go to bed? Do you guys choose to wake and put an alarm on? Do you ever choose to consume alcohol? Do you ever choose to consume alcohol in excess? Do you ever choose to consume alcohol in excess? See where I'm going with that? Meaning I'm drinking a lot. It begins with a choice, does it not? Everything that humans do begins with a choice. Up to including the choice to be intimate which combines the sperm and the egg. And then some people are like, well, that child had no choice, right? Child doesn't have a lot of choice until we get to this concept of an age of an accountability where a child is sentient enough or aware enough to begin making his own choice. And what age does that start? I don't know, my daughters chose what they wore to school when they were 2 years old, and I would get in trouble on a regular basis because why in the hell would you let them wear that? That's what they wanted to wear. Well, it doesn't match. I don't care. You leave me home with the kids, they get to choose what they want to wear. Because I don't care if they match. How I roll as a father. When my oldest daughter's favorite movie was The Wizard of Oz, and she would wake up in the middle of the night screaming because she had dreams of witches going around and around and around and around her room, and she used to call it Wizard Sabazbaz, I bought a Godzilla poster, put it on the wall, and said, Godzilla will eat the witches. The dreams ended. So I roll. We were in a corn maze. She was about 3, and there was some dude dressed in a gorilla suit, and I pack heat. And so I had to promise her to calm her down if the gorilla ever came back, that I would pull my gun out and I would shoot it. Therefore, we beelined out of the corn maze as quickly as we could so I didn't have to follow through with that promise. That's how I roll as a father. Anyway, sidetrack.